Look at a globe. Spin it to the bottom. There, anchoring the entire planet, is a great white shape, Antarctica. And you think you know what you're looking at, a frozen continent, a land of ice. But here is the truth that almost nobody stops to think about. You are not looking at land at all. You are looking at a lid, a vast, blinding white lid of ice, in places more than 4 kilometers thick, sealing something underneath it. And the thing it's sealing away is not what you'd expect. Because down there, buried under all that ice, crushed in total darkness, is a second Antarctica, a hidden continent, the real one, with mountains and valleys and canyons and the dry beds of ancient rivers, a landscape no human eye has ever seen and no human eye ever will. And that landscape is hiding a secret that completely rewrites the story of this place. Because this buried land remembers something. It remembers a time when it was warm. I want you to really sit with that, because it sounds impossible. The coldest, harshest, most lifeless place on the entire planet. The continent where the temperature can drop below -80 degrees. The place that kills almost anything that tries to live there. That place was once green. It had forests. It had rivers that flowed and swamps that teemed with life. It had creatures walking across it under a milder sky. Antarctica was not always a frozen hell. For most of its existence, it wasn't frozen at all. And the proof of that lost warm world is still down there right now, frozen in the shape of the land itself, sealed under kilometers of ice like a memory that the planet refuses to let go of. Over the next half hour, we are going to peel back that ice. We're going to uncover the real continent hidden beneath it, read the clues frozen into the buried landscape, and reconstruct the warm, living world that existed here before the cold came down and buried everything. And by the end, you're going to look at that white shape on the bottom of the globe and see something completely different. If you want to take that journey with me all the way back to a green Antarctica, make sure you're subscribed before we begin, because this is a story almost nobody knows, and it's one of the strangest things our planet has ever hidden from us. So let's start by getting rid of the ice. Let's imagine just for a moment that we could strip it all away, every last bit of it, and see what's actually underneath. The Antarctic ice sheet is almost impossible to picture properly because nothing in our daily lives is anywhere near this scale. It holds the overwhelming majority of all the fresh water on Earth. It is not a layer of snow. It is not a thick winter coating. On average, this ice is well over 1.5 kilometers deep, and in its thickest places it goes down more than 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers of solid ice, stacked from the ground up into the sky. If you stood at the surface there, the actual rock of the continent would be further beneath your feet than the cruising height of many aircraft above your head. It is an almost unimaginable weight of frozen water, so heavy that it physically presses the land down beneath it, pushing entire mountain ranges deep into the crust of the Earth. And for a long time, that's all anyone could say about it. The ice was simply a barrier. Whatever lay beneath was a complete blank, a mystery sealed under a roof you couldn't open. We had better maps of the surface of Mars than we had of the ground under Antarctica, because at least Mars we could see. But over the last few decades, that changed. Scientists found a way to look through the ice without ever touching the ground. They flew aircraft back and forth across the continent, line after line, for years, firing radar waves down into the ice. Those waves passed straight through the frozen sheet, struck the solid rock far below, and bounced back up. And by carefully timing those echoes, by listening to the planet the way a bat listens to a dark room, they slowly built up a picture. A map of the land that no one had ever seen. The shape of the continent hiding under the lid. And what that map revealed was breathtaking. Because the land down there is not some flat, featureless slab. It is a whole world. There are mountain ranges buried under the ice that rival the Alps. Entire ranges of jagged peaks completely entombed. Their summits thousands of meters high, and not a single one of them ever touched by sunlight. There are deep valleys and gorges. There is a trench that plunges far below the level of the sea, one of the lowest points on the planet that isn't under the ocean, carved deep into the bedrock and packed solid with ice. An entire dramatic landscape of highlands and lowlands, all of it hidden, all of it dark, all of it frozen in place. And buried in that hidden landscape was the first real clue. The clue that this place had a warm and secret past. Because when scientists looked closely at the shape of those buried valleys, something didn't add up. These valleys were the wrong shape to have been made by ice. And that single observation cracked open the entire mystery. To understand why the shape of those buried valleys is so important, you have to understand that ice and water carve the land in completely different ways. They leave different signatures, and a trained eye can read them. When a glacier, a slow river of ice, grinds its way across the land, it bulldozes everything. It scrapes out broad, deep valleys with steep sides and flat bottoms. If you look down the length of a glacial valley, its cross-section looks like the letter U, wide, rounded, gouged out by sheer brute force. But flowing water does something different. A river doesn't bulldoze. It cuts. Over millions of years, a river slices a narrow, winding channel, branching out into a delicate network of tributaries, like the veins on a leaf. And a river valley, in cross-section, looks like the letter V, sharp, narrow, cut down by running water. Now here's the thing. When scientists mapped the land buried under parts of the Antarctic ice, they didn't just find U-shaped glacial valleys. In some of the oldest, most deeply buried highlands, they found V-shaped valleys, networks of them, branching, winding channels of exactly the kind that flowing rivers carve. River valleys, buried under kilometers of ice, in the coldest place on Earth, were the unmistakable fossilized shapes of ancient river systems. Think about what that means. Those valleys were not made by the ice. They were made before the ice. They were carved by liquid water, by rivers running across open ground in the warm light of day, long before a single snowflake of the modern ice sheet ever fell. The ice didn't create this landscape. The ice came along afterwards and buried a landscape that already existed. A landscape that had been shaped by rain and rivers, by the patient work of flowing water over enormous spans of time. The ice is a relatively recent visitor. The land underneath it is the memory of a far older, far warmer world. And that completely flips the story you've been told. We think of Antarctica as a place that has always been frozen, a permanent block of ice as old as the planet itself. But that's not true at all. The freezing is the new part. For most of its history, this continent was not white. It was every color but white. And those buried river valleys are the proof, hiding in the dark, holding the shape of the water that once ran through them. If that just gave you a small chill, that the deadest place on Earth is secretly a drowned green world frozen mid-breath, do me a favor and drop the word rivers in the comments, just so I know you're with me as we go further back. Because we're about to do exactly that. We're about to travel back to the time those rivers were flowing and meet the warm Antarctica they belong to. To picture that world, you have to let go of the map you carry in your head, because the continents have not always been where they are now. The ground beneath your feet, wherever you are, is sitting on a giant slab of the Earth's crust, and those slabs move. Slowly, just a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow. But over millions and millions of years, those tiny movements add up to journeys across the entire face of the planet. Continents drift, they collide, they tear apart. They wander from the equator to the poles and back again over the long, deep history of the Earth. And for a vast stretch of its past, Antarctica was not alone at the bottom of the world. It was joined together with other land masses, locked into a single gigantic supercontinent. South America, Africa, India, Australia, all fused into one enormous mass of land, and Antarctica was nestled right in the middle of it, connected to its neighbors, sharing their climate, their plants, their animals. It was not an isolated frozen island. It was part of a living, breathing, interconnected world. And the climate of that world was warm. Genuinely, deeply warm, in a way that's hard to square with the place we see today. There were long stretches of Earth's history when the entire planet was far hotter than it is now, when there were no permanent ice caps at the poles at all, when forests grew at latitudes that are buried under ice today. And Antarctica lived through those times. It basked in them. The land that we now think of as the ultimate symbol of cold spent a huge portion of its existence under warm skies, covered not in ice but in green. So what did that green Antarctica actually look like? What grew there? What lived there in the warmth before the freeze? Because this is where the lost world really comes alive. This is where we find the forests near the bottom of the planet and the creatures that walked among them under a sky that did something very, very strange. Imagine standing in that ancient Antarctica, tens of millions of years ago, or further back still. There is no ice sheet. There is no blinding white. Instead, stretching away in every direction, there are forests. Real forests, of tall trees, their canopies spreading under a mild sky. There are ferns carpeting the forest floor. There are mossy banks beside flowing streams, the same streams whose valleys are now buried kilometers deep. The air is humid and alive. Insects move through the undergrowth. The whole landscape breathes with green life, right here, in the place that would one day become the most lifeless continent on the planet. And we know these forests were real because the trees left their bodies behind. In Antarctica today, in the rare patches of rock that poke up through the ice, scientists have found fossilized wood, petrified tree trunks turned to stone, lying exactly where they grew. They've found fossilized leaves pressed into ancient rock so perfectly that you can still see the delicate pattern of their veins. They've found coal, and coal is not some random mineral. Coal is compressed, fossilized plant matter, the crushed remains of vast quantities of vegetation, buried and squeezed over millions of years. There are coal deposits in Antarctica, and every lump of that coal is a tombstone for a forest. You do not get coal without enormous amounts of living plant life. The presence of coal in Antarctica is, by itself, undeniable proof that this frozen continent was once buried not in ice, but in dense, thriving greenery. But trees and ferns are only the stage. The real question is what walked across that stage, and the answer is the thing that makes this lost world truly spectacular. Because among those Antarctic forests, in that warm ancient age, there were dinosaurs. Let that settle for a moment. The continent of ice, the most hostile place on Earth, was once a place where dinosaurs lived and hunted and raised their young. Their fossilized bones have been pulled from the Antarctic rock. Plant eaters and meat eaters, creatures large and small, animals that could only have survived in a land that was warm enough and green enough to feed them. There were no dinosaurs shivering on a glacier. They lived in a forested, temperate world, a world that just happened to be located where the South Pole's ice cap now sits. And they were not the only ones. The fossils tell of a whole community of life, of reptiles and amphibians and early relatives of mammals, of a rich and complex ecosystem that flourished here for ages. And here's the detail that makes it almost dreamlike. Even back then, even in that warm age, Antarctica was sitting near the bottom of the world, near the South Pole. And being near the pole does something strange that has nothing to do with temperature. It changes the light. Near the poles, the planet's tilt means that for part of the year the sun barely sets, and for another part of the year it barely rises. Months of continuous daylight, followed by months of deep, lingering darkness. So these forests, and the dinosaurs living in them, had to endure something no tropical jungle ever faces. They lived through long polar nights, weeks and weeks of dim twilight and darkness, where the warm forest sat under a sky with no sun, and then, months later, weeks and weeks of endless day, where the light never fully went away. Picture it, a herd of dinosaurs moving through a green Antarctic forest, not through snow, but through ferns and trees, in the strange gray half-light of a polar night that goes on for weeks. Life that had adapted not to cold, but to darkness. Trees that learned to survive months without sunlight and then drink in months of it without pause. It is one of the most alien and beautiful scenes our planet has ever staged, and it happened right here, in the place we now think of as nothing but a frozen wasteland. The warm world and the polar darkness existing together in the same impossible place. So this was Antarctica, forested, warm, walked by dinosaurs, lit by endless days and endless nights, a green continent thriving at the bottom of the world, which leaves us facing the single biggest question of this entire story, the question you've probably been holding in the back of your mind this whole time. If it was warm, if it was green, if it was full of life, then what on earth happened? What turned this living paradise into the dead, frozen lid of ice we see today. How does a continent like that freeze? The death of warm Antarctica was not a sudden event. There was no single catastrophe, no one terrible day when the ice came crashing down. The truth is slower, and in a way more haunting. The warm world didn't die in a moment. It was slowly strangled, over millions of years, by a combination of forces that quietly closed in around it until the cold finally won. The first force was movement. Remember that the continents drift, locked on their slow-moving slabs of crust. For ages, Antarctica had been joined to its warm neighbors as part of that great supercontinent, sharing in the global warmth connected to the rest of the living world. But the supercontinent was breaking apart. Piece by piece, over enormous spans of time, the other land masses tore away and drifted off toward the equator. South America pulled away, Australia pulled away. And Antarctica was left behind, increasingly alone, drifting into the loneliest position on the planet, settled directly over the South Pole, isolated at the very bottom of the world. And that isolation turned out to be a death sentence because of what happened in the ocean around it. Once Antarctica had fully separated from the other continents, with nothing but open water surrounding it on every side, the ocean was free to do something new. A current began to flow, all the way around the continent, an endless circular river of cold water with no land to block its path. Round and round Antarctica it went, and it still goes today, the most powerful ocean current on the planet. And that circling current acted like a wall, a moat of cold water that wrapped around the entire continent and cut it off from the warm waters of the rest of the world. Before, warm currents from the tropics could drift south and bring their heat to Antarctica's shores. Now that circular current sealed the warmth out. Antarctica was locked inside its own cold embrace, refrigerated, quarantined from the rest of the planet's heat. And at the same time, the planet as a whole was cooling. Over these same long stretches of time, the Earth's climate was gradually shifting from one of its hot, ice-free ages toward a colder world. The amount of heat-trapping gas in the atmosphere was slowly declining, and the global temperature drifted downward. For most of the world, this was a gentle change, but for a continent that had just been isolated at the South Pole and wrapped in a moat of cold water, it was the final push. And so the snow began to stay. This is the quiet, creeping way an ice age begins. In a warm world, snow that falls in winter melts away in summer. But as the climate cooled, there came a point where the summers were no longer warm enough to melt all of the previous winter's snow. A little bit survived, and the next year, a little more. And that surviving snow, year after year, began to pile up and compress under its own weight, slowly hardening into ice. The first small ice caps formed on the highest mountains. Then they spread, creeping down the slopes, filling the valleys, those same river valleys that had once run with liquid water. The green retreated. The forest died back. The dinosaurs were already long gone by the worst of it, lost in an earlier age. But whatever life remained was pushed to the very edges and finally extinguished. And the ice kept growing. It thickened and it spread until the separate ice caps merged into one continuous sheet, and that sheet swelled until it had swallowed the entire continent. Mountains were buried. River valleys were entombed. The forests, the streams, the whole warm living landscape was sealed away beneath a growing dome of ice that would eventually reach kilometers into the sky. The warm world wasn't destroyed. It was buried. Pressed down into darkness and locked beneath the lid, exactly where its frozen shape still lies today. That's the part that I find almost impossible to shake. The green Antarctica didn't vanish. It is not gone. It is still down there, in the shape of the land, under all that ice, holding its breath in the dark. And the ice that buried it has, in a strange way, become its protector. Because that ice has been keeping secrets. It has been preserving things down in the cold and the dark that take this story from astonishing to almost unbelievable. The ice doesn't just hide the lost world, it remembers it. And what it's been holding on to for millions of years is the final piece of this puzzle. The Antarctic ice sheet is not just a dead weight sitting on top of a buried continent. It is, without anyone designing it to be, the single greatest archive of the past that exists anywhere on our planet, because of one remarkable property. As that ice built up, layer by layer, year after year, falling snow trapped tiny bubbles of air inside it and then sealed them in as it hardened. And the ice has held onto those bubbles ever since, which means that locked inside the deep ice of Antarctica are millions of tiny, perfectly preserved samples of ancient atmosphere. Real air, breathed by a world long gone, trapped in bubbles and waiting in the dark. When scientists drill down and pull up long cylinders of that ancient ice, they are pulling up time itself. The deeper they go, the further back they reach. They can crack open those bubbles in a laboratory and analyze air that has not touched the open sky in hundreds of thousands of years. They can read the temperature of the planet in the distant past, measure exactly what the atmosphere was made of, and trace the rise and fall of the world's climate across vast stretches of history. The buried continent doesn't just hold the shape of a warm lost world. The ice on top of it holds a breath-by-breath record of how that world changed. It is a library, written in frozen water, that we are only just learning how to read. And the ice preserves more than air. Down at the bottom, where the immense weight and the faint heat from the rock below combine, something even stranger waits. Liquid water. Hidden lakes, sealed between the ice and the bedrock, kept liquid by pressure and the planet's inner warmth. Lakes that have been cut off from the surface and from sunlight for unimaginable lengths of time. Entire bodies of water, some of them large, lying in total darkness beneath kilometers of ice, untouched, isolated, sealed away in the buried landscape of the warm world that used to be. We are only beginning to understand what might live in that black, ancient water, in conditions as alien as anything we'd expect to find on another world. So when you put it all together, the picture of Antarctica completely transforms. It is not, and never was, a simple dead block of ice. It is a continent with a hidden body of mountains and valleys and dry riverbeds. It is the buried grave of a green and forested world that was once walked by dinosaurs under skies of endless day and endless night. It is a landscape that was slowly strangled by drifting continents and circling currents in a cooling world, then sealed beneath a growing dome of ice. And it is an archive, holding the ancient air and the hidden water and the frozen shape of everything it used to be. All of that, under the white shape at the bottom of your globe. All of that, kept in the dark, remembered by the ice. And here is why this matters. Why it's so much more than a strange story about the past. Because Antarctica is proof, written into the rock and the ice, that the climate of our planet is not fixed. It is not permanent. This continent has been warm and green, and it has been frozen and white, and the difference between those two worlds came down to the slow shifting of the land, the currents of the ocean, and the makeup of the air. The Earth has swung between these states before. That warm Antarctica was not a fantasy. It was real, and the same planet that produced it produced the ice as well. The buried forests are a reminder that the world we think of as solid and unchanging is, on a long enough timescale, anything but. There is something humbling in that. We look at Antarctica and we see the ultimate symbol of permanence and cold, the one place that surely has always been and will always be frozen. And it turns out to be one of the best examples on Earth of just how much our planet can change. A green continent, lost beneath the ice, holding its breath in the dark, remembering the warmth. If a place that absolute, that final, that frozen, was once a living forest at the bottom of the world, then it should make us look at every solid, unchanging thing around us a little differently. Nothing about this planet is as fixed as it seems. So the next time you spin a globe and your eye falls on that great white shape at the bottom, I hope you don't just see ice anymore. I hope you see what's underneath. A whole hidden continent of mountains and rivers and buried forests. A lost warm world, sealed in the dark, waiting and remembering. Because Antarctica is not the story of a place that has always been frozen. It is the story of a paradise that the cold came for, slowly, over millions of years, and finally buried alive. And the most astonishing part is that, deep down beneath all that ice, in the shape of the silent land, it is still there. If this changed the way you see the bottom of the world, Tell me in the comments which part stayed with you the most, and subscribe, because there are more of these buried stories under our feet than you could ever imagine, and we are going to keep digging them up one by one.